Welcome. Thank you for joining and tuning in to our panel discussion today, Growing Up with Mockingbird in the Era of Black Lives Matter. I'm Christina Hartley. I'm the director of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House and a former high school social studies teacher. I admit that I did have students read scenes from To Kill a Mockingbird on occasion as a way to understand and see race relations in the 1930s. So we at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House are pleased to offer this panel presentation with the authors of Mockingbird Grows Up as we embark on new types of expanded programming. And I will be able to order books for our attendees if they are interested. They are $36 and that is with a big discount, but if you are interested, please send me an email and I'll put my email in the chat in just a little bit. And I will send you more detailed information. So what we're going to do is we're going to let Reg moderate the panel, and he's going to ask the different authors specific questions related to their chapter. If you have comments or questions, you can use the Q&A function down at the bottom. I will kind of collect and curate those questions for a question and answer session at the end of our presentation. We're going to try to keep the whole thing to an hour, but knowing us and how much we like to talk, I think it probably realistically, it'll be 5:15 when we finish, and we'll hope to do, by 5:15. If you have to leave earlier, I understand. But so I'm going to introduce our panel moderator. Reginald Dyck is a recently retired English professor and former department chair at Capital University in Columbus with a focus on 20th century US fiction. He is the first editor of Crisscrossing Borders in Literature of the American West, and author of several articles on Native American literature, Willa Cather, and other U.S. authors, often focusing on class issues. He is a former high school teacher who taught To Kill a Mockingbird many times, and I will let Reg take it away from here.
Thank you, Christine, and it's great to be moderator of this panel of serious scholarly readers of these two novels, and of course many others as well. I'm going to have the panel members introduce themselves, and as they introduce themselves, I'd like them to respond to this question. So a lot of Pulitzer Prize winning novelists are forgotten in a few years. This one's still remembered and more than remembered 60 years later. How do we account for that? What makes this such an iconic American novel, taught so much and read so widely, put on Broadway? And so just that. And so if just, in addition to introducing yourself in a sentence or two, give us your take on what's the staying power of this novel. So Brandie, I'll ask you to go first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brandy Boney. I am a doctoral candidate in the Rhetoric and Writing program at Bowling Green State University. My research looks at the influences on the teaching writing practices of novice English teachers. And I also have a long history of teaching English at the high school level and have taught To Kill a Mockingbird many, many times. I think that's sort of my answer to that question. The fact that To Kill a Mockingbird has ended up becoming a traditional part of high school English courses. Every time I taught freshman English, that it was part of what we taught. My kids are both in high school. They've both read To Kill a Mockingbird as freshmen in high school. So I think part of that is because it ties into so many historical contexts that are really important.
Good, thanks. Adam, do you want to go next? I think you're still muted.
Hold on a second. Yeah, so that was actually half of what I was going to say, so that's good that we have an agreement about that. I mean, one of my big points was just it's in the high school curriculum, And so if it's widely read, it becomes popular. I think the movie has part to do with it as well. And then I think part of it, and we'll get to this a little bit later, because it's a story that we want to tell about ourselves. So I'm Dr. Adam Nemmers. I'm a assistant professor at Lamar University in Beaumont. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on.
Good, thanks. Waikiko?
Hi, I'm Waikiko Dreyer, associate professor at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I have a joint appointment in English and in ethnic studies, and my research is in film and visual culture, specifically autobiography written by celebrities and people who are African Americans who are in the entertainment, who are using print literature to really augment their own stories. I think the staying power of To Kill a Mockingbird is that it is a focus on communities. Definitely the African American community, but also the white community, and how it answers to its own production of horror and terror. And I think that this is really what gives it its strong legs.
Good, thanks. Leland?
Hi there. Thanks, Reg. I'm Lee Person. I'm a professor of English at the University of Cincinnati. For most of my career, I focused on 19th century American literature and some early 20th. But a recent research project has focused on novels about race and written by white writers. So To Kill a Mockingbird fits right in. I think it's had staying power in part because it has a lovable narrator. Like Huckleberry Finn. I put it in that same category for the same reason, but I also think it's a feel-good novel. Relieves a lot of white guilt. Makes us, we imagine all the Black people standing up when we do our best to defend accused rapist like Tom Robinson.
Good, thanks. Monica?
Hi, I'm Monica Carroll Miller. I'm an assistant professor of English at Middle Georgia State University in Macon, Georgia. And a lot of my work focuses on Southern women writers. I'm the president of the Flannery O'Connor Society. My first book, Being Ugly, Southern Women Writers and Social Rebellion, looked at ugly women in the work of Southern women writers. And I'm currently working on a book right now that I'm editing on the Tacky South. And I think that the first scholarly consideration, book-length consideration of the Tacky South, that will be out from LSU Press in about a year or so. And I think that the appeal of this book, I think it shows how very much people need heroes and need fictional characters that they see as heroic. And I agree with Leland's point that I think that this book makes people feel better about themselves. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation about this today.
Okay, thanks. And Shelly, who is one of the co-editors as well as essayist for this volume.
So yeah, I think I'm going to just repeat and re-emphasize a lot of what has already been said, but I am Shelly Reuter from the University of Cincinnati, and I teach American and African American literature and medical humanities. So I mostly focus on race and nation, and most recently disability studies. So I'm the editor along with John Kulick of Mockingbird Grows Up, Rereading Harper Lee, the volume that has brought us all together here. And we've really all have a stake in it, I think, as readers and as teachers, but I think as a couple of other people have already said, Kwakiutl in particularly, also as community members, because this is a story all of us on the panel and many, if not most Americans have read. There's actually apparently a big international reach for this book, I've learned. So lots of young people influenced by this book, but it's really a beautifully crafted book. It's a memory narrative. It's really kind of a nostalgic revisitation of maybe an idealized American childhood. And so maybe it's the childhood we wish we could have had or the one that we want to remember. So, things like hanging out with the neighborhood kids, playing games, it's just this huge imaginary canvas. But one of the things that I did want to say also is that there are consequences for us reading this book uncritically. And I think that's the thing that united the panel. Actually, we all sort of understood that if we just read it in these sort of nostalgic ways, then that can be a problem. You know, if we just want to think it's an exemplar of racial justice rather than admitting that it also has a sort of a legacy of trying to preserve this Andrew Jackson, Simon Finch sort of legacy, that that if we don't take that object on too, then we have a problem.
Okay, good, thanks. So now to the more specific questions, and Leland, we'll start with you. The novel's set in the 1930s, but it was written in the late 50s. I think both crucial settings for the novel there. So I wonder if there are what you see as key events or movements that we should keep in mind as we're rethinking the novel there.
Well, I think this is a key question, and it was a key question even before Go Set a Watchman was published, especially for a novel that really gives us so few historical cues. Although it's set in the 1930s, Mockingbird is no more a novel exclusively about the 1930s than The Scarlet Letter is exclusively about 1640s Massachusetts Bay Colony. Harper Lee wrote the novel, as you said, in the late 1950s. Oh my God, or I should say OMG. Think of what's going on or is going on while she's writing this novel. Most importantly, clearly, Brown versus Board of Education, Supreme Court ruling. 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat. Same year, Emmett Till is lynched in Mississippi. 1957, the Little Rock Nine are blocked from entering Little Rock High School. 1957, of course, the Civil Rights Act. I mean, what a time to be writing a novel about the 1930s. So it's not surprising that she would write a novel about the 1950s and then, I guess, backdate it, you might say, to the 1930s.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question, just one specific. So how do you see Brown versus the Board of Education impacting the novel through its presence, maybe its absence, or if you could you take that just one incident and give us just a little bit on that?
Well, as Watchmen makes very clear, that that decision just disrupted so much in the South, and it's sponsored the citizens' councils that we see so dramatically meeting from the very same balcony from which Scout watches the Tom Robinson trial, which I think is just an amazing and wonderful coincidence, a repurposing, you might say, of a balcony. So, I mean, how you ignore that? I mean, you just can't. If you're writing a novel about, 1950s, Macomb, Alabama, you don't ignore that. You set it back in the 1930s. In a way, you're achieving what the Citizen Council wanted to achieve, and that is to send us back 20 years to a time when everything was just right.
That's a astute observation. That's a good point there. Yeah. Monica, I'll go to the next question here. So how do we, I guess, in a sense, make this book relevant? How do we connect it to the present world of, the racial context today? Black Lives Matters, the police killings. We know that context. How do we bring these two together, quite in some ways disparate times, maybe not so much?
Well, what prompted my essay is that I had pre-ordered Go Set a Watchman, and it arrived the same day as my pre-order of Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And getting those two books in the mail on the same day was a really stunning experience. And reading Go Set a Watchman, rereading Mockingbird in the context of just reading Ta-Nehisi Coates, as well as a Black Lives Matter movement, really, I think that especially what Watchmen did is it kind of highlighted and brought out a lot of what was already in Mockingbird that was easy to overlook. Especially in doing research for this, I was shocked at how most of the scholarship, the reading guides, the teacher's guides to Mockingbird just takes Tom Robinson's death at face value, that he was trying to escape and that they shot him in the back. reading that, especially in the context of Between the World and Me and Black Lives Matter. I was teaching it as well, and my students and I all went, yeah, that whole like, oh, they shot him in the back, he was trying to escape, rang pretty hollow to us. And so I think that a lot of what Reading Mockingbird and Watchmen right now is doing is kind of teaching us how to look for what's hidden, right? Or what we would prefer to ignore. I really appreciate in Leland's article his kind of discussion of how Mockingbird centers the white experience in a story of racial justice, and centers it around the white experience and white people's feelings. And I think that that is a big conversation that we're having today, and I'm glad that we're having right now, that we need to be more than just call ourselves white allies, that if nothing actually changes, then we're not actually doing anything. And I appreciate in Watchmen how Jean Louise, we see her struggling through her recognition of white privilege, and we see her not completely successful, but I think it's I appreciate the kind of honest portrayal of seeing her struggle through figuring out her own complicity in racial injustice.
Yeah, yeah. I'm struck by what you're saying, because when I was teaching it, the term white privilege didn't exist, I don't think. It certainly wasn't one I was familiar with. So I think we really do read, in a sense, a different novel in some ways. You've clued us in quite nicely on that. Any other comments, just really briefly?
But again, I really think that when after reading Watchmen, you go back and you read Mockingbird and you're like, even when Atticus is famous, we should walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, he doesn't say that as a morality lesson for Scout. He says that as a trick for getting along with people. And so reading it, from a different perspective, there's a lot in there that I think, even in her revision and setting it in the 30s, there's still a lot that remains that we can see.
Well, you made a nice segue to my next question there, and I actually maybe misread, because I'm framing it as, it seemed to me one of the key moral moments, and that says something about the morality that the way you're framing it there is that idea of walking a mile in another's skin. And my question, Shelly, then is what seems to me is really important about our moment today is that we're talking structural racism rather than just individual racism. So does that moment still work for us anymore, or is it missing the boat?
Well, you see that even though Monica and I have only met each other once, we've actually done this sort of mind meld, because she actually set me up perfectly for the answer that I was actually going to give you. So actually, I would say exactly what she does, that it's an ideal, it's an adage, it's not an ideal, it's not what Atticus actually lives by. Just one moment here, that I do think he tries. I honestly think Atticus is...
The question, Shelly, just a little bit to say, is it an adequate adage? If it was an ideal, if he could live up to it, is that what we need right now?
Well, certainly, yes, empathy is important. Absolutely, empathy, not sympathy. And I think part of the problem in this book is that it is about sympathy and pity and all of that, and not about empathy, not about really being with the person. So Atticus is a really conflicted character. And I have a friend, a colleague, recently retired, who read the book when it just first came out, before the movie came out. And she saw Atticus as imperfect, even in the book, but the movie changed everything. I mean, Gregory Peck changed everything. But I think one of the things that but if we put ourselves back in that 1960 to 61 frame of mind, and then we can really consider maybe Atticus, even in the book, without it being sifted through that movie mindset, was not so iconic and perfect and ideal. So when he says this, he also says some other things that we don't pay much attention to. And the other adage, I think the one that he actually lives by, is you can shoot all the blue jays you want, but remember it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. And that's the one that allows for this sort of the white privilege, that actually protects white privilege into sort of double consciousness. Because while it may be a shame that Tom Robinson was killed, it's not the end of the world. Like, okay, Tom Robinson, after all, was a blue jay, or actually at one point, according to Underwood, the journalist, he was a songbird, but still he was a common songbird. I mean, he was a disabled Black guy, and he was beautiful. He had no function other than to sing, but he wasn't a mockingbird. That got reserved for the Finches and the Radleys, these sort of very privileged, sort of old aristocratic, genteel, poor elite.
Okay, good, thanks. Brandie, your essay raised some issues I'll have to say I hadn't thought about, and specifically about language, and you take on some really interesting moments there that I think are key moments, and also have to do with structural qualities rather than just individual qualities. So you dealt a lot with language, and you set up Scout's use of language, Jem's use of language as they're talking about Calpurnia's language. So what is it about language that gives us a new entrance into thinking about race in the novel here?
Well, I love this question because a lot of what's happening in the text speaks to language-based discrimination issues that we still see very prevalent today. So both Scout and Jem's reactions to Calpurnia's ability to use two different English dialects, they speak to similar and both problematic understandings of mainstream and non-mainstream English dialects in the United States. So if I start with Jem, his understanding of the language difference is more extreme. So he understands his white dialect as the correct dialect, and as Cal's Black dialect as deficient. And his comment about Cal speaking the English of her community when she knows it's not right, that speaks to that kind of pervasive and still really common misunderstanding about English dialects, that any dialect outside the mainstream is wrong, and that speakers of these othered dialects are ignorant or lazy for not using the right conventions, right? So Jem just can't square the fact that Cal is able to use his right dialect, his correct dialect, with her need to use her own English in her community. He can't pull those two things together, and that's what she's trying to explain to him. Scout is a little more forward thinking in that early in the book, she evaluates Calpurnia's use of language. She evaluates Cal's use of language in context, right? So in chapter 3, when she says that when Calpurnia gets angry that her grammar gets erratic, that's in her very white context, right? So she's judging Calpurnia's language based on this very white mainstream standard. And when she sees Cal in her own community speaking with other Black people, suddenly it occurs to Scout that this is perhaps not a wrong language, but a different language. It still speaks to a problematic sort of separation between, on one hand, we have places and times where we have to use this mainstream dialect, and we have these other places in the community where those can be used. And those are still, both of those perspectives, Jem's perspective of right versus wrong, and Scout's perspective that's all based on context, those are still both very prevalent linguistic issues.
Good, thanks. I'd like to kind of invite a few others into the conversation and maybe extend this to Watchmen. And how do we see language working in that novel? Maybe not in quite so specific details like you've given us there, but we have various interactions. How does Jean Louise's interaction with Calpurnia change in the second book as compared to the first book? I wonder if that might reveal something about a different set of are a different way of looking at the racial tensions there. Is that clear what I'm asking?
It's clear to me. I'm going to let someone else pick up on that because I don't know that this is widely known among all of our panelists, but I have not read Watchmen because I have issues with the way that it came to be published. Okay. So on moral ground, I haven't actually read that text. Mm-hmm. So I'll let someone else pick up from there.
Sure. Sure.
Reg, I will jump in then if you don't mind. And actually, Brandie, you are in for a treat because a couple of questions down the road, we will be discussing the provenance of Go Set a Watchman, and it might not be what you think it was. But I will, I hope I can convince you and win you over. But I will have to say, to me, the most meaningful moment in Go Set a Watchman is the moment where she goes to Calpurnia's house. This had been forbidden in To Kill a Mockingbird. She kept wanting to go to Calpurnia's house, and Calpurnia won't let her. I mean, there's a world apart, and Calpurnia really has to preserve the privacy of her world in the African-American community. But Jean Louise, as a 26-year-old, just sort of barges into her community and demands, she's very frustrated by her because she will not speak Jeff Davis's English. That's one of the things that she specifically says at that moment, that basically she doesn't realize what she's asking of Calpurnia. She's asking Calpurnia to always translate herself to the white community and to always be available in that way, to sort of feed that myth of the fact that, you know, the white community is wonderful and she's perfectly happy with the status quo.
So are you suggesting maybe she hasn't changed too much between the two books? We still have that linguistically revealed in still linguistically, but in a maybe broader sense, the same kind of conflict or same problem going on?
Absolutely not. And I actually think, to Harper Lee's credit, she plants the seeds that we might not be getting the whole story. I mean, there's a lot of people who talk about how Harper Lee is, you know, she just creates this sort of monolith and refuses to see. I think Harper Lee actually recognizes that that what she's doing is heteroglossia and not really adequately presenting it from all sides. But she doesn't pretend to be capable of that either. I mean, I think she just drops these little hints, like, you know, Calpurnia talking under her breath in To Kill a Mockingbird.
Well, again, I think both of your answers reveal how careful reading really pays off. The details really matter in this novel. But the question I'm going to bring to you, Adam, is a bit of a shift, and it's a broader question rather than detailed question. So this panel is sponsored by the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, and so I think it would be good to make some connections between Stowe's great novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and To Kill a Mockingbird. One of the things in thinking about this question struck me was that they both have been endorsed by important African-American leaders of their day. Frederick Douglass was quite supportive in his North Star newspaper of the novel, not without certain questions, but I think clearly very positive about it. And To Kill a Mockingbird has received praise certainly from Oprah Winfrey, but also President Obama has referenced it and I think spoken well of the novel. And yet, what we've been talking about are troubled kind of depictions of African Americans, and yet we have these African American leaders, if not endorsing, speaking quite positively about that. How do we negotiate that? What are you thinking about that, Adam?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things, just to start off with, I think a lot of African American leaders and prominent cultural figures are just happy to see any depiction of African Americans being read. It's interesting when I teach African American literature to ask my students, many of whom are even African American, if they've read any African American literature. And one of the things, we try to think about is, like, does a novel like this count as that sort of thing? Because it does actually have African American characters in it. Depending on, where you grew up and what your high school curriculum was, this might be one of the only times you actually confronted, even in literature class and African-American characters. I think that that's one of the first things. It's just, it really does start to raise some of these issues, which is interesting. You know, to go along with that point, I think that even if they're kind of tidily dismissed certainly in To Kill a Mockingbird, it does raise some of these issues that people may have been unaware of, or at least would rather sweep away. And so I think that again, even if the answers are a little bit inadequate, at least it is raising the questions. And I think for leaders, like I said, in the Black community, just to see that these questions are being asked is important. Couple things that people have already mentioned. I think having a common text, and that was the case certainly with Uncle Tom's Cabin, something that's just so widely read. Again, it has a cultural conversation with it. And when you have different people from different walks of life, different ethnicities, different groups who are all reading the same text, it really does give a commonality, I think, that encourages these conversations. And that's the case with To Kill a Mockingbird, certainly. And just to finally follow up on that, I don't think that Watchmen would be positively portrayed or endorsed in the same sort of way. Certainly, I mean, part of the publication controversy, I think, is part of it. But mostly it seemed to be created with sort of shock and dismay and kind of a like, what happened, rather than an endorsement or anything other than you should read this, you know, for what did they do to my characters. So I think that's a really interesting idea too. But like I said, I think the biggest part of it is just that any depiction of African Americans will actually have people talking about it, and the more people that are reading it, the more that those are foregrounded.
Okay, so a kind of strategic approach that this is a useful novel. It's going to do some good, even if it's, as you say, not a perfect novel. And I think that was definitely what Frederick Douglass was thinking.
Yeah.
He certainly had his doubts, but it certainly raised the issues he cared about.
And I mean, one other thing is I do think that in the time that they were first published and first came into prominence, probably the depictions were seen as less problematic as they are now. And that's probably part of the issue too. And I think that's one of the deals with Go Set a Watchman. If that actually had been published back, you know, when Mockingbird had been, I do wonder what the reception would have been like at that point. Whereas when we're reading it in, you know, the 2019, I guess it was released, or 2018 or whatever, and we're very attuned to this sort of thing, I think we look for those issues that maybe in the past people would not have really been attuned to. So.
Okay. Good. Kwakiutl, were you wanting to respond to that? I've kind of felt like you maybe were wanting to jump in a little bit, or not.
No, not. I was really, you know, the commentary on the story is just really so fascinating here. What I just want to say here is that what I love about what Harper Lee is doing, and interesting, I did not like the movie. I did not care for the book at all. And so it wasn't really until I started to really give it a close read. I've never taught it either. Because you know, Atticus Finch was like this kind of savior, and it just wasn't. So it wasn't until I started to read it again that I finally realized in my mind what Harper Lee was doing, where she asked the question, how do communities handle the horror that comes into their communities? And I loved what she did. It's, you know, the people are being told they just need to get over it. It's happened now. It's happened now, right? So, and at the end of the film, it doesn't go back into the community to see what happens. What happens when Mamie Till leaves Mississippi? You know, after the trial, what do people say? And after lynchings, what do you say when you go back to the house? You know, what happens? What's the conversation? How does this affect you? And Lee does this. But I don't get any like, oh my God, this has happened. What are we going to do? It's like, no, we need to get over this. This is, instead of moving through it, it's let's get over it.
Mm-hmm.
You see. So that's when the film, well, that's when the book itself became beautiful to me.
Mm.
Because so much of the attention is on the Tom Robinson, the family, how Mayella did this to him.
Mm-hmm.
But what Lee asks us to look at, those elements that are in the community that makes this even possible.
Mm-hmm. So the question that I'm going to ask now of you complicates that community even further, because I'd like to bring up the issue of class that is quite important in the novel as well. Mm-hmm. What about the role, say, of the Ewells and their class standing, and how do Black and white class standings work? Could you say a little bit about how class and race, the tensions intersect within this community of the novel?
Yes, and the class and race, they're there. They're the obvious, right? Of course, they're there. Poor white women coming of age at this particular moment in time. Here you have Mayella, who is living in between the space of the Negro community, and then she's like on the outskirts of her community, but she touches on the Negro community, right? She knows this. Then you have the community at large here that has marginalized her because of her class. But the thing about Mayella Ewell is that it doesn't matter. This is what Lee tells us. It doesn't freaking matter what class I'm in. I am white, I am female. And you want to talk about language? Let's talk about speech. Let's talk about speaking, and let's talk about speech acts and what that does, right? Here, all I have to do is say, you know, I'm going to call you on your airs. I'm going to call you on your Southern gentility. I'm so happy I'm from the South because I caught it. And I got it. So, you know, I'm going to call you on it, and you had best step to it. And they do. Mm-hmm. They do. So it's race, whiteness, especially female whiteness, trumps race. This is what Mayella has done. She's trumped it. And how does she know that? And see what Lee does. I don't know if we're supposed to even get that, right? I don't think we're supposed to get it, but I got it, and we've got it, right? We got it.
I like the way you're bringing it back to structures and not just the individual aspect.
Yeah.
Shelly?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's very possible that the way we people in mainstream culture read Harper Lee's novel is very different than the purpose for which she wrote it. And actually, John Kulick talks about this in our volume, and so does Joe Crispino in his Atticus Finch novel, that really, since she was writing these two books together at the same time, as I think people know by now, that actually she wrote Goes to Watchmen first, and it was rejected by the publisher, because I think, as Adam said, maybe it would have been too controversial for its time. It really was bringing up more of a, it was exposing some of the truth about the way structural racism works in a way that they Go to Kill a Mockingbird was able to hide. I mean, the story is, and we have every reason to believe, that Tay Hohoff was actually told her that, hey, we really want the novel about your childhood. Do it from your childhood memory, not from your experience as a young adult woman. And so, of course, you had this whole filter that was constructed that actually protected whiteness in some ways. I think exactly what Kwakiutl is talking about. So Mayella was able to become white. She was able to access whiteness. It didn't matter what class anymore. If she stepped into it, and I think what Dr. Dreher says, really, she stepped into her white femininity. And so, you know, when Jem, in this little bedroom argument that him and Scout have in To Kill a Mockingbird, is talking, he's like, there's 4 types of people. And he's, you know, there's us, there's the Cunninghams, there's the Ewells, and then way down on the very bottom is the African Americans. Mm-hmm. And he says it just like that. So really, honestly, if we're going to look at this book, I think we need to look at Jem as actually the voice of truth and reason.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the thing I just wanted to add too, with, you know, with Mayella, I mean, it's very interesting. It's significant that she initiates her speech acts in the courtroom, the place of legality, the place where rules policies flow out from which policies and rules flow, right? And so I think that in and of itself is a significant move on Lee's part here. And I just think that overall, as I said in my article, that she has created the most formidable white female character in modern literature. She has done it, and we miss it. Yeah. And it's deliberate, because we don't even, you know, she's a like this shadow. Mayella is hovering. She's hovering, and then we don't see her. We don't hear from her until when she's in that courtroom.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. Okay.
And
it's genius. Go ahead.
I would just add to that Mayella and her father both speak very similarly, but he gets chastised in the courtroom for how he speaks. She absolutely does not. She absolutely does not. That just builds that white female power. Like that it's very powerful.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
She dismisses Atticus. She just dismisses him. I got something to say. All right, this is okay. Let's just cut this other mess out.
Okay, we need to move on. We've been getting at and touching on Watchmen, but now let's have a question specifically toward it. And this is one that I'd like everybody to respond to, Leela, and I'll ask you to respond first. And then as your ideas connect with the person in front of it, we could kind of build that way and take whatever order seems appropriate. So just a basic question: how do we reread Mockingbird in light of Watchmen?
Well, I'll start by just telling a story. When I taught both Mockingbird and Watchmen shortly after Watchmen came out, I was teaching a freshman seminar, and we started actually with The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah.
And so we came to Kill a Mockingbird, having read those 2 novels. And I had, this was a freshman seminar, as I said, and I had students, one student in particular who said she was afraid to read Watchmen. Mm-hmm. She thought it would, she'd heard enough about it that she thought it would change the way she viewed To Kill a Mockingbird. And, you know, I think that's the danger or the promise, depending on how you look at it, that I don't see how, after reading Watchmen, you could ever read To Kill a Mockingbird the way many people, not everybody by any means, but a lot of people have read it as a story about this feel-good story about a white man who comes to the defense of this crippled black man who's been wrongly accused of rape.
Yeah, good.
If I could jump in, I think that the best way to read Mockingbird now is to actually read Mockingbird. I think several people have touched on the fact that Gregory Peck kind of looms over it so much. That if you actually read Mockingbird, it starts and ends with Jem. You know, part of it is a coming of age story of Jem. And I think that part of what we'd be doing is reading what's actually in the pages and not the image of Gregory Peck in a courtroom. Something that one of my favorite things I've read about Watchmen was Catherine Henninger's article that is titled something like, "You Killed My Childhood." And that so much of the negative response to Watchmen has been people who have clung to Kill a Mockingbird as this beacon of hope that things will get better and people can be good. And I think that, you know, especially as somebody myself who lives in the Deep South right now, something that's hard to do is to let go of our sentimental, nostalgic visions of the past. But if we're ever going to actually move forward, we need to learn how to kind of be grown-ups about it and be able to look at things that we clung to in the past that maybe aren't as wonderful as we like to think they were.
Great, that's a good point. Next. Adam, you want to jump in?
Let me unmute here. Yeah. So just echoing the points from before, I mean, I definitely agree, you know, I thought the title of our volume was good because it is much more of a grown-up book, Watchmen. The thing that I wrote about in my essay that I think really speaks to our time is the divergent sort of media that we find in Watchmen, and how the same event or the same news can be read in very different ways depending on who you get your news from. And so I think that's the same thing with Mockingbird, is that when you're looking at it, it really depends on how you read it and when you read it and how it was taught and what your environment was like. And so I agree that if you go back and read it now as an adult, because I think most people really, you know, read it when they were 14 or 16. And if you go back and read it in the year 2020 as an adult, I don't even think you necessarily need to have read Go Set a Watchman to have a different reading experience with that. And so I would echo those before who have said that actually the text will speak very differently depending on the context and when it's read.
Okay. Kwakiutl, do you want to jump in? How do we reread the novel in relation after we've read Watchmen?
I think you have to take them as their own cultural artifacts. I think you need to read both of them. They have to be read both because it's a probably, I say this very loosely, a holistic read of a person and the place and the culture of the time, right? People don't start, you know, as people start out in one particular place, as they move along, they do not stay the same way, right? They change. Change is inevitable, right? So the question is then, how do they change? And what does their change mean for the community within which they live, or for their own life? What does it say? And what does it say about our culture, our own history, the time and place at the time, if you will? So take it as a way of, I think we can read it as a way of complementary to what we already have had.
Okay.
It doesn't denigrate it. If anything, it gives us a different, it gives us another pathway to talking about race relations, class relations, communities, and the things that happen therein that cause particular kinds of responses. You see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, good, thanks. Complementary, that's an interesting term there. Brandie, I'll ask if you wouldn't mind reflecting a little bit on your choice, and then Shelly, excuse me, if you can briefly kind of conclude things then with the response.
Sure. So again, I haven't read Watchmen, but I think you'd have to be living under a rock, even if you haven't read it, not to have some context of some of its contents, right? So I think one of the things that is beautiful about a text like Watchmen is that it pushes us outside of that happy ending with the bow on top, right? It pushes us outside of that hero narrative. It pushes us to reread more critically and think more deeply about some of the subcontext, if you will. And this is sort of what we've been talking about, like everyone misses that Mayella is absolutely a power character, and we, you know, that gets skimmed over so frequently. If we can reread with a different set of eyes and reread a little bit more critically and less with the, oh, I'm hoping for the happy ending, maybe we start to draw more of the really significant meaning.
Good, thanks. So Shelly, how has your reading changed after reading Watchmen?
Well, it's really opened it up a whole lot. I think Kwakiutl is exactly correct that neither of these novels is really about racial justice. It's neither one is a model for racial justice. It's about navigating a world in which fraught race relationships exist. And I think both of them are also about finding one's place or trying to preserve a certain vestige of an old white aristocracy, really. And so I think if we realize that, if we read those both, I mean, Jean Louise is coming of age in Go Set a Watchman. She really is. Everybody calls To Kill a Mockingbird a coming of age story, but it's a childhood story, whereas she does come of age and have to decide on what her place is going to be, whether she just leaves it all behind or whether she actually somehow figures out a way to navigate it, just like Atticus did before. And Atticus is not really such a surprising character. We should not be surprised by the Atticus that we meet in Go Set a Watchman. The fact that he would be hanging out with he's always willing to talk to all those white people. He's always willing to talk to all the different classes of white people, recognizes himself as a sort of an icon in the community. And he wants to do for, but not with the Black people in To Kill a Mockingbird. And then in Go Set a Watchman, he realizes that the Black folk are trying to do for themselves. And he's uncomfortable with that. And so I think it's quite natural, honestly. I mean, in the real story, Atticus is A.C. Lee. This could be something that he really would do. So I'm going to end just with a little, and so really for us, the purpose is to grow up ourselves, that we grow up through the process of reading both novels, and that we see, okay, we can't have it both ways. We can't say it really was wonderful what happened in To Kill a Mockingbird. We have to just understand that as a negotiation story. And I do want to end with a little provenance story of our volume, actually. And it started with John Culloch, who is not here this time, the co-editor of the volume. But he gave a talk on the provenance of Go Set a Watchman at my local library system, the Campbell County Public Library. And I was so impressed with it because I was so irritated with all these claims that, Atticus, this was Ahab turned into a whale or something like that. And I was so irritated with all these kind of paranoid claims about, oh, she must have been, put under, she was in distress and she wasn't right in her mind. All this other stuff. She had this manuscript. The people that she was trying to protect, whose reputations that she were trying to protect, A.C. Lee, her sister, her whole family, they were dead. She was like, okay, it's fine. I'm going to release it now. It's okay. That's all that happened. So the fact that she was willing to release it to the world, and it was such a wonderful story, so interesting and so haunting, really has done good in the world already. I will say that some of my students have come to me and said to me, look, I've had the same argument with my father. I love him, I adore him, I admire him, but I hate the way he thinks about race. Yeah. He pretends to be perfect, but he's not. So I think it's great at opening it up for us.
It seems like maybe in relation to the two novels, we're sort of saying it's there in Mockingbird. Watchmen sort of magnifies things, that going back to Mockingbird is the key thing. Okay, let's go to audience questions there and see what our listeners are thinking about.
Okay, so in the chat, there's been a discussion kind of going along in the chat talking about the order in which the two novels should be taught. And I think a couple of the panelists have weighed in on, they would suggest teaching Mockingbird first And then kind of, let's see, teaching Mockingbird first with the literary criticism on its socio-cultural historical importance, and then follow that up with Watchmen, because it really, that's also chronological in terms of here's what it was like in the 30s and here's what it's still like in the 50s. So that's one aspect of what's going on. We also had an earlier question, and I'm going to read it for the panel because I'm not sure if everyone read it, but an earlier question, one of our participants here says that she's the grandmother of 2 dark-skinned boys through adoption in her family. And she's done lots of reading, mostly nonfiction on anti-racism, on white privilege, but she would like some suggestions on good fiction to read to help guide her own growth in racial justice paths.
Okay, I saw that. And I wanted to, she gave the ages, I think, did she say 4 and
1.5?
Okay, I would go to children's literature. I would go to African-American children's literature. Let that be first. I mean, it is there, it's beautiful, uplifting, talks about hair, it talks about skin, it talks about who's going to be my friend, all of that. I would suggest at first Darla Davenport's book, Naya and Friends. I can get you the name to that if you send me your email. And it's about a group of students who are integrated, multi-ethnic, So yeah, I would start with children's lit first. That's my strong suggestion there. Build them a library. And I tell you, books for me, I mean, they are the mainstay, in terms of, really uplift and helping with self-esteem and giving with the imagination, fantasy. It's just fantastic. Yes.
And then there was a follow-up question that said, do you think Harper Lee really valued Black lives? And I know one of the panelists commented yes, but it only went back to the panelists. So,
yes.
But, there's, let's see. And so we talked about what order to go in, agree. So thank you to panelists. This has been a great conversation. I used the Cincinnati Library to help me with, building up a body of literature, etc. I don't see any other questions per se in the chat, but Shelly, it looks like you wanted to say something. Go for it.
I mean, to the question of whether she valued Black lives, I think presumably so, but that wasn't her interest. I mean, her interest was in figuring out what was the legacy of the Finches, right? I mean, after all, I'm probably big spoiler here, but she might not even be Atticus's kid, right? She might be biologically Uncle Jack's, right? But anyhow, so they both loved her mother. So anyhow, this is good Southern literature for you after all here. Welcome to the world of Faulkner here. But she's interested in the way it is and what the world is supposed to be like, what the community is supposed to be like. I think I would go back to the issue of the library very much, because even when you're reading Harper Lee, which I would say, yes, we should still be reading that. I know that part of Reg's question is, should we even be reading Mockingbird with all of its possible negative implications? It can be a bad book to read. To Kill a Mockingbird can be, honestly, even like Nabako Adoajai says, it was so embarrassing for her in her class reading experience how, the white people cheered when Atticus won the case, and when the Reverend said, "Stand up, your father's passing," and all of this stuff, and it was awful for her. And yet, sort of in answer to that question, I think, while To Kill a Mockingbird is certainly here to stay, we should still read it. but we should also definitely read other books all the way through from, as Kwakiutl said, all the way from Ezra Jack Keats, all the way on up, Black authored books, including the 1959 A Raisin in the Sun. It's still a great one. 1 year before Harper, we've got to give books by Black folk about a Black community experience a greater voice in all of this. If we want to, it's maybe the question needs to be whether we value Black lives and Black experiences.
Well, and one thing I was just going to add is that I mean, I agree. I don't think that was the intention of really either novel. I mean, they're really pretty transparently about her and her journey to understanding that, like, the 1930s that she grew up in, that she had no idea what was going on. I mean, she starts Watchmen coming back from a train from New York and like reading the papers, and then, you know, she comes back to town and it's really like, okay, it's about her figuring out, okay, this is actually what was going on when I was a kid. And so I think, you know, again, there are some different lessons to be learned there, but I don't think there's a lot of activism there. I don't think there's a lot of, you know, like racial sort of advocacy. I think it's mostly inward looking at her and the other people she grew up and talking about how, you know, they really were unaware or were willfully ignorant about what was going on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, I have another question that's a different topic, so put on your thinking caps. We have an attendee who would like to know from the I'd like the panelists to comment on Dr. Finch hitting Jean Louise in Watchmen. It's a very jarring moment, and Lee seems to want us to see it as a turning point. So, what are your assessments of that scene where Dr. Finch hits Jean Louise? Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll jump in. He couldn't have done it.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, it's just one more thing that gets changed drastically between Watchmen and To Kill a Mockingbird, where Atticus, whatever you think of him as an attorney, and I don't think much of him that way, but he's also idealized as a father, a single father.
Yes,
no,
exactly.
no question about it. And Watchmen might cause us to to rethink that one too.
Well, I think that that Watchmen is really about Jean Louise learning that, you know, heroes are human, you know, and that she'd used Atticus and her uncle as these, you know, gods to live up to. And this novel is about, what do you do in the maturation process when you realize that your parents are not perfect, you know, and what do you do when they're beyond not perfect. If you didn't get from seeing them at the White Citizens Council, then let's bring it home with Uncle Jack hitting you. You know, you should have gotten it when you saw the White Citizens Council, but just in case you didn't catch that, we'll make it very clear.
Okay.
On the largest scale, pulling off of what Leland and Monica just said here, what do you do with your legacies, right? How do you handle your legacies when all the men in your family, some women, have been told to you that they were these big people who really manifested, you know, wealth or whatever, a good reputation in the community, and then you find out, right, that how your wealth was built was off of owning enslaved people, and you found out that the way that your forefathers or whomever treated them in such a way, you know, that causes you nightmares, you know. I mean, this is what, on the larger scale, this is what we're going through in our own nation now, tearing down statues of people, you know, renaming buildings in our academic communities. I mean, this is the brilliance of Lee. She takes these things and she says, well, okay, so there is this who you are, you know, this big man in the community. So how do you manifest or find or dig your interior resources to resolve that which you know? Because it is not easy, and it's jarring, and it will mess with your identity and your history.
Yes. And one of my favorite moments in Go Set a Watchman, I'm always an impish reader, but one of my favorite moments is when Hank, the boyfriend, calls Jean Louise a privileged spoiled brat. And which is, so he's saying, you know, she's like, oh my gosh, what were you doing at that White Citizens Council? You and my dad. And he says to her, look, Scout, I might think like those other guys, but I have to fit in with the white boys. You are lucky. You don't have to. You got to run around. You can do everything you want. You can smoke. You can fly around. You can do whatever. And they'll be like, there goes Scout. There goes that Jean Louise. She never changes. Because, you know, you remember, Scott, I mean, her father was this total permissive parent, right? Nobody got to behave that way, the way Scout and Jem got to behave. And certainly not the Black children, right? But so Hank actually tells her, like, you know, I have to fit in my community. I have to take what privilege I can. And at the end, now I don't cotton to Jack hitting her in the mouth, but I will say what happens then is that she says, okay, I am going to side with Jack. I am going to side with Jack and my father. And she even says, I am a Finch. And she says, so she has to decide, that is her wake-up call, that she has to decide between Hank, who's sort of in this place that you always have to navigate and negotiate and think about it, or between just accepting the privilege of being a Finch. And that's, of course, when she does, she realizes she's going to come home. She's not going to go back to New York.
And it's these mental calisthenics that Lee takes us on. I mean, as I said, what happens with discovery, right? Yeah.
All right. Was there any other comments, or it looks like we've pretty much exhausted the questions, and you know, there's been a little back and forth in the chat, but it looks like we've answered all of the questions. So any last big statements from anyone before we wrap up this afternoon? All right, so I will just have to say, on behalf of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the people watching. And please check our website, stowehousecincy.org, or read our email newsletter that comes out once a month, and sometimes a supplemental little announcements newsletter, but to see all of our upcoming events. And we appreciate your time this afternoon and want to thank everyone for joining us.